Welcome to Norse Code, episode Big 70. Big 70. It's a good number. I'm your host, Dusty O'Connell, and I am here with our regular co-host and analyst, blogger for Daily Norseman, editor-in-chief of Vikings Territory, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good. How are you, Dusty?
I'm really great. I am actually not in the bedroom bunker control center in Denver, Colorado, where I normally reside. Instead, I am at the newly christened Studio Dick Butt with our intrepid producer, James Pagachnik. How you doing, James?
I'm enjoying breaking open a bottle of champagne at this new place. Except it's not champagne, it's water. And
it's not a bottle, it's glasses.
It's not a bottle, it's glasses, and everything's just full of sadness here in Grand Forks, North Dakota, except for Dusty.
We had such great success with the three-man pod last week that we decided to put out not only 2 episodes in 2 weeks, but up the ante a little bit and bring in a 4th member for this journey, this final journey before the NFL draft takes place. Joining us this week from edraft.com is a guest on the show. I'm pretty sure you've been on before, Luke Inman. Welcome back, Luke.
Hey, a lot of pressure you just put on me already, man. This is a lot of pressure to live up to. But thanks for having me, guys. Really appreciate it. Just getting excited, man. What do we got? A little almost 24 hours here until the big show arrives, and I'm just excited, man. I'm ready to get going.
Well, that's great. Just a couple of housekeeping things to get out of the way before we get down and drafty. I wanted to take a moment and go through our email account and see if we've gotten any new contributions. Yes, there was one that we were expecting from a fan of the show and personal friend of ours, Logan Mironoff-Chin. He proposed a deal that if we could drop an episode within 24 hours of recording it, then he would donate again to the show, and we lived up to our end of the bargain.
It was actually closer to 12, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so in our inbox is a hot and fresh donation from Logan Mironoff-Chin with the note, "You guys suck."
So letting you guys know, we can be bribed to be professional and put the show out on time.
Bribing us is the best way to do it, it turns out.
Yeah, as it turns out, that's actually a really great idea.
So please direct all bribes to the NorseCodePodcast.com website, where you will find a donate link at the bottom right-hand corner of the page.
And clearly we have no shame in being degraded for any type of money, any form of currency whatsoever. So we will take whatever we can get at this point. Am I in on the cut here? I don't even know if I'm in on the cut here yet, guys. But I'm going to act like it.
You're just going to shill.
You know, depending on how effective your shilling is, we could talk.
I feel like I'm on Shark Tank. I feel like I'm on Shark Tank. Just a really bad episode of Shark Tank right now. trying to get you guys to invest in me right now. And what I'm seeking is $100,000 for 10% equity.
So no, listen to the pitch. It's
man.
A 4-man centipod. It goes down real smooth. $100,000.
Oh, goodness. Our other contributor is a listener since episode 1, as he includes in his note. He has been a contributor to the mailbag before, and I had no idea that he lived in Austria. Manuel Nidero contributes his $5 to the show, ponying up for a lifetime of listening to Norse Code. So thank you, Manuel. We genuinely appreciate that you have, for reasons unknown to us, chosen to continue listening to the show all the way from episodes 1 to 70.
Man, we were lucky that those initial Christian Ponder Sucks episodes were prophetic. Oh, man.
It's so funny to go back and listen to some of the early stuff we've done, because like the Vikings landscape looked so much different the beginning of 2 seasons ago when we started the show. We're coming up on our 3-year anniversary in a couple of months, and I mean, the face of the team is completely different. Our analysis has changed a little bit. The ghost of Christian Ponder has hopefully left the building. And it's great to know that we have a dedicated core fan base that wants to keep us keep on podcasting and, you know, maybe usher in a new era of regular playoff contenders. I
And
guess.
and it's awesome to have people kind of to help donate to the show to keep the lights on and to keep the show from being incredibly annoying with ads. We'll be regularly annoying, but we want to keep the ads away. You don't want to hear Dusty talk about Audible. You do not want to hear me talk about Stamps.com. And as we've talked the last couple of weeks, Arif and Me Undies, you do not want to hear a pitch from him. So we want to keep this as pitch free as far as ads. We don't want bumpers and before from back in like the 30s and 40s episodes. We want to keep this nice and content driven. Thank you so much for keeping the lights on, Manuel and Logan. And we happily suck. Apparently, we suck for $10.
Yeah. Well,
Maybe
so
you do.
speaking of donations and Me Undies, the 3rd-year anniversary gift is traditionally leather, so keep that in mind when you're donating to the show.
I feel like that's really more of an Andrew Christian thing and not so much of a Me Undies thing. But that is neither here nor there.
We'll deal with that when the time comes. But Rick Spielman had a news conference today. He came out of his closet. No, that came out wrong. He came out of the cave. Sorry, I saw the picture of him flashing the guns earlier, flashing the biceps, and I don't know what happened there. That was
Rick Spielman clearly puts in his work at the gym.
I think it's because he's intimidated by brother Chris. Luke, did you catch any of the presser? Did you catch it on Twitter? Did you catch it on the stream?
Didn't catch it on the stream, playing catch up as we speak. Caught a lot of the main bullet points or highlights of it. As you guys have mentioned at the top here, Adrian Peterson likely to stay. Doesn't sound like much of a smokescreen at this point. It sounds like everything that you've heard from him in the past is living up to basically what he's been pretty consistent on throughout this whole pre-draft process. So he's likely going to stay unless you see some kind of blockbuster trade headed his way, which I don't see happening, especially in this deep, rich class of running backs. And then the other big bullet point, like you guys mentioned again at the top, is just they want to get out of that 11th spot. Like I've mentioned throughout this process, I think guys about 10 through 25, they kind of all seem to be ranked similar and not much of a drastic, I guess, big ranking jump from one guy to the next. So if you're trying to get some value like the general, aka Rick Spielman, always does, I think he's really going to try to move out of that 11th spot. Where? I'm not exactly sure yet. I know we'll get to that here in a second, but I think those were the two main, I guess, bullet points that I took away from that. Was I missing anything else?
No, those seem to be the main things. We can talk about some of the other odds and ends. We can talk about the discussion of analytics that occurred in the press conference, maybe a little bit too much in the press conference in a little bit. But let's hit on that first point real quickly about Adrian Peterson. So the thing about this is, so he didn't really mince words on this question about Adrian Peterson, but I think that he left himself a lot more wiggle room than initially it seemed like. Because I remember, so he was initially asked, hey, so Adrian Peterson, whatever. Interestingly, that of the 30-minute press conference, it took 17 minutes for someone to ask an Adrian Peterson question. So good job, Rick, for finding ways to keep us on message. But he did say, in no uncertain terms, we want Adrian on the team. But dancing around the question of whether or not he would trade Adrian Peterson, Chris Thomason, I don't really know how to pronounce his last name, Pioneer Press, asked him outright, are you saying there's no chance that the Vikings trade Adrian Peterson? Or something along those lines when he asked for a definitive statement from Spielman about trading Adrian Peterson. And Spielman would not answer that question. He instead said, I just want to bring us back to Mike Zimmer's words that said, we would love to have Adrian Peterson on the team. He's on contract, and we plan to have him on the team in 2015, and we have no interest in trading him. None of those are denials of the possibility of an Adrian Peterson trade. I think Matt Venzel noted that on Twitter, too. And so I will say that he did leave himself room on that question of an Adrian Peterson trade. I think, Luke, you're right. They're looking for a blockbuster deal. I don't think they'll get sort of Harvin offers or Harvin compensation, which is kind of weird to think about in retrospect. But I think that they're looking for at least a first-round pick. And given sort of the reports from Charles Robinson and a couple of other people, that itself might be difficult.
Well, if you think about it, like if the team is really trying to, build itself around Teddy Bridgewater, if he's going to be the franchise quarterback, he needs another year or two fully develop really before he can be the kind of leader I think that the Vikings want. And there is no question that the Vikings offense will perform better and give Teddy a better chance to develop into that leader without accident or injury or things going amiss if Adrian Peterson is there to kind of distract defenses or provide a second opportunity for the offense rather than just the Bridgewater passing game. And so it's so hard to deny that the team would be better with Adrian Peterson than without. That if you have the end goal of fielding a playoff team this year, in 2 years, or in 3 years, the road to doing that is much shorter with Adrian Peterson on your team than without.
Plus, Rick Spielman's put in a position where, of course, he's not going to completely outright deny, no, there's not a chance in hell that we are going to trade Adrian Peterson. Like, in case something else actually does come along. Like, of course, we will answer a call. We probably won't, do anything after we listen to our voicemail or something. But we'll keep it open. Like, sure, we'll listen to a possible trade of, 30 receivers for him or something. We're not actually going to do anything.
They will only trade for the entire Buffalo Bills 50-man roster.
Minus Percy Harvin.
Yeah.
Exactly. Fuck that guy. That guy's not coming back on the team. We'll accept Castle before we accept him.
No, just stemming off your point, though, I think you're right. I mean, not many play the game, right, quote unquote, better than Rick Spielman. I think you're right. I mean, the big thing going into this year, at least for me, is the progression of Teddy Bridgewater from year 1 to year 2. No doubt, obviously, Adrian Peterson's going to be able to help you in that aspect, bringing 8-9 men in the box, opening up a lot of deep downfield passing lanes. But when you look at even the bigger picture, if you could get some sort of compensation, right? How many great years are going to be left with Adrian Peterson? The question has to be asked. I'm sure Rick Spielman's asked himself that question plenty of times in the mirror late at night when nobody's around, I'm sure, hopefully not, that what is the ultimate compensation or fair compensation for that? And the big thing with Rick Spielman, I mean, he mentions it a lot. We're not just building for today or tomorrow or next year. He's always looking at 2-3 years down the road, 5 years down the road. And I think if the right compensation was there, he certainly would pull the trigger. I just don't think, again, in this class of running backs, with the contract that a team's going to have to really take on with AP, and obviously he's getting up there now in age, even though I think the fact he didn't play it all last year is more beneficial than hurtful in the retrospect. But I think that ultimately, I just don't think that compensation is going to be there. I think we've all heard plenty of rumors. The latest one I've heard, Tampa Bay offering their second-round pitch, which really just a late first-round pick, right? Pick number 33, and then maybe a player or two to be named. Jonathan Banks, I think, was flung out there, and then like a next year's third-rounder. I mean, just to ask you guys your perspective on that trade. Do you think that's enough compensation right there to really give out? I mean, again, one of the core pieces, not only in your offense, but again, he's going to be a big vital piece to progress Teddy Bridgewater from year 1 to year 2. What do you guys think about that? At least just that specific trade rumor that again, maybe has got flown out there in the past couple days.
I'm actually just envisioning Rick Spielman walking up and down the Mall of America or walking up and down Eden Prairie, just muttering to himself, maybe staring at his hands, going, what is the end goal compensation? What is the end game here? What is it going to take to get this fixed? What is the compensation?
Well, this just sounds like a setup for Rick Spielman, just sort of entering a nightmare of draft nihilism where he just keeps playing the game without knowing why. Plays the game so well. What's the win condition? Can you win?
Nope. Does anyone ever truly win? But it's like this is a situation. This isn't like Josh Hamilton going back to the Rangers. Like the Angels were willing to get rid of Josh Hamilton without really knowing the details of like how they were going to get rid of him. It turns out that it's very good for the Rangers and bad for Hamilton. Peterson is still very, very valuable to the Vikings, and so I think that a second and a next year third and Jonathan Banks or a similar player would still be a fire sale. And I don't think that the Vikings have any interest at all in fire sailing Peterson.
I think that makes sense. I think so. I've mentioned before that I'm sort of relative to other people. I think I'm a bit bearish on Peterson's market because I predicted a while back that the proper trade compensation for him would be a second-round pick and a fourth-round pick, unless you're picking late in the order, in which case it'd be a second-round pick and a third-round pick. I was able to move him actually for that in a mock draft with some members of Draft Twitter. And so for me, if I was the general manager, which I think we can all agree is probably a good thing that I'm not, if I was the general manager, I would move Adrian Peterson for that kind of compensation. Of course, you want to bring the price up to a second and a third and stuff like that. But yeah, so if he got a first round pick, I'm guessing, he's considering it. I don't think he's like ruling it out nearly as much as is being indicated. Obviously, if a trade's going to happen, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen, on draft day. Maybe not even on day one. It could happen on day two with, a package, maybe this second round pick plus, a second round pick in the future or a first round pick in the future, that sort of thing. I'm okay grabbing Tampa Bay's, pseudo first round pick / high second round pick, in addition to other compensation, like a fourth round pick. I suspect other people are not. His trade value in the eyes of fans and media seems to have gone up, which, that's kind of crazy because, we're falling for it. If there's a game being played by Spielman, that means we're also falling for it. Mm-hmm. But I remember earlier in the process, you had people, and John Clayton was being kind of silly, but you had people guessing that Peterson's ceiling, his value ceiling, was a fourth round pick. That was absurd to me. But there were people who were arguing, he's a third round pick because he's super old. And, I was arguing you get a second round pick and then some. And, other fans were arguing, well, we need 3 first rounders for Adrian Peterson. Value was all over, but for the most part, it was pretty low on Peterson. And as the process has continued, people are like, well, will a first round pick be enough for him? I don't know if I would give him up for a first round pick, which is unusual because some of these same people were indicating that they would give him up for a second round pick and then some. I would have, sort of given up the goat. And I guess that would be undervaluing Peterson based on what his market seems to be at the moment. But yeah, I would do it. I don't know if the Vikings would do it. But if they do that, do you think it's better to grab Todd Gurley, assuming his medicals are fine, and it sounds like his medicals are exceedingly fine? Is it better to grab Todd Gurley at 11? Maybe don't even trade down, right? Just grab Todd Gurley at 11, and then figure out sort of the rest of your draft needs, or would you want to wait on a running back in a class sort of this exciting? Plus, you have Jerick McKinnon, who I think has all kinds of talent to be a feature back. Plus, you can get maybe a complementary back to McKinnon in some way, maybe sort of later in the draft and find maybe a higher value position like defensive back, like linebacker earlier on if you trade Adrian Peterson. What are your thoughts on that? Would you rather get Gurley, or would you rather pair someone with McKinnon and gamble on McKinnon's talent?
Well, I personally think that it's kind of a gung-ho move and a quick reaction move when teams get rid of a star player, a face of their franchise, and try to replace it right away with their first-round pick and immediately try to fill the big, giant shoes and the void left by that former franchise player. Think back to Randy Moss days. They traded for the 7th overall pick and a Napoleon Harris, and all of a sudden, what did they do with that 7th pick? They obviously traded or drafted Troy Williamson, which I just think is unfair to do that to that young player. You're talking about a 21-year-old, 22-year-old kid coming in, and really the expectations are unfair right from the get-go, from the fan base, from the media.
We even talked last week about how some people consider him the worst Viking of all, worst Viking draft pick of all time.
Right, thanks, Mike.
Because of where he was put.
Exactly. It's a really tough situation to do that. And I think the other big point that you mentioned was Jerick McKinnon. I think, like you, I think this kid's got tons of talent. I'm a little worried about that lower back surgery that he had. Haven't heard a lot of updates on that. I know those back surgeries can tend to linger a little bit, especially when you're talking about playing a physical sport like football. But I think in this draft class, again, Rick Spielman, all about the value. I think it would be foolish to really go and try to invest another early round pick on a running back when you can wait and match up a guy like, David Cobb or Duke Johnson, Amir Abdul. There's tons of them. pick your guy, who's ever highest on your board, and match him up with Jerick McKinnon. Because as we're starting to see the league kind of evolve into this passing league, you know, I read 68% passing to a 32% run ratio nowadays. I think you're starting to see more teams start to get away from that one power horse back that you're going to give 25, 30 carries a game, and really start to mix and match and find some thunder and lightning, some balance to go along with a couple guys. So I think maybe you find a more of a bruiser back, a guy to eventually replace a guy like Matt Asiata down in the red zone and a goal line back, and you let Jerick McKinnon do his thing later on. And I think you use that first-round pick on a bigger priority position, like you mentioned, a defensive back, or maybe if linebacker's bigger on your board, you go that route. I just think in the end, though, it's almost too unfair to ask that prospect to fill those shoes, you know, unknowingly and unwillingly, especially a guy like Adrian Peterson. It's just too much to ask.
Well, let's move on to the second point of the conference then, and talk about our point in the draft. We're currently at the 11th pick. And it's unless Rick Spielman is throwing out all sorts of crazy stuff in front of us and crazy fog, we're going to be trading our pick. Now, Arif and I are very much with the belief that if nothing else, you just trade to the Browns. Like, you're going to get something amazing for the Browns. They're going to trip over their own shoes. And we're gonna go one down and get something decent. But where do you see us likely trading, and what are some of the interesting scenarios as to what we could get for the pick?
Yeah, right off you said it, right? Cleveland Browns, we've traded back one spot, ironically enough, with them 2 of the past 4 years. I think the Cleveland Browns at 12 make a lot of sense. You know, one thing that is really starting to pop in the back of my mind here is that Spielman is really trying to push trading down. And as we saw last year, he's willing to do it at a little bit cheaper, more of a bargain price than maybe what the value chart says, right? Those trade value charts maybe would indicate. Last year, I know we only moved down one spot, 8 to 9, but being a top 10 pick, I thought we would have garnished a little bit more than just a 5th round pick. I was pretty surprised about that. So I think you're going to see him really try to move down. I think you're going to see him be a little bit more of a bargain shopper, so to speak, and move down for a little bit less than maybe what the charts say. 11 to 12 is going to make a lot of sense, though. Browns, are they after Danny Shelton, a true nose tackle, probably the best nose tackle in this draft? Are they after one of the big 3 receivers that fall? Devontae Parker likely being that in this scenario. The Miami Dolphins, not too far behind at pick 14. They've been on record saying they want one of the big 3 receivers, maybe even the market for Todd Gurley, like you mentioned earlier. What could you get, you know, moving down from 11 to 14? Again, I don't think Rick's going to ask a whole heck of a lot. You know, maybe they just get a 3rd round pick, and maybe he would be ecstatic about that. 15 to San Francisco, another likely landing spot. I don't see them moving drastically, at least right away. You know, I don't see them moving from 11 to, say, 21. Maybe the Bengals want to move up and grab a guy or something like that. I think they're going to take it slow right away, and you might see him even try to move down twice. But that first trade, 12 to the Browns, 14 to the Dolphins, and even 15 to the San Francisco 49ers, who, again, could be after one of the big 3 wide receivers, maybe even Dorial Green-Beckham, don't put it past them, or a cornerback like Trey Waynes, who could still be on the board. Seems to be the consensus, I guess, you know, media or stereotypical nationwide number 1 cornerback on a lot of people's boards, Trey Waynes, which we'll probably get to in a little bit. But I think those 3 teams make a lot of sense. And again, I just don't expect, you know, just don't expect Rick to really be asking a lot for compensation for moving down for some of these draft picks. But again, Browns, a receiver, maybe Danny Shelton. Dolphins, again, maybe Todd Gurley or one of those receivers. And then the Niners, I think, maybe would be in the market for, again, one of those big 3 receivers, right? You got the big 3, you got Dorial Green-Beckham, and then it seems to be a pretty consensus drop-off, but maybe Trey Waynes or one of their top cornerbacks on their board as well. And then maybe after that, you could see him maybe try to trade down again. Who knows?
All right, so I do have a question about trading down with the Browns. So both times the Vikings traded down with the Browns, they somehow convinced the Browns, maybe they were even speaking the truth, that a number of their potential trade partners were going to select the player that the Browns wanted to select. Trent Richardson at the time, that made a lot of sense that you could, create a market for Trent Richardson.
Right.
And I think Justin Gilbert, a lot of people, maybe not sort of among the amateur draft enthusiasts that you find in third-party draft organizations, but definitely big draft and NFL media thought that Justin Gilbert may have been the best cornerback in that draft. So it made a lot of sense that teams would draft at a position that's always highly coveted in the draft, that cornerback, and that's the reason that they traded up one spot. My question is, you would have to convince the Browns that a partner that is willing to trade with the Vikings and someone the Vikings are willing to trade with would want Danny Shelton, which I think most people seem to agree is the Browns' primary target, which makes a lot of sense. Their nose tackles are both very bad. I mean, their backups is Shmaley Kitchen, who I just recently learned is still in the league. And Danny Shelton's supposed to be sort of the special nose tackle, but you also have players like Malcolm Brown in this class who may be more of a one gap nose tackle, but still a nose tackle.
Yep.
You've got Eddie Goldman, you've got Jordan Phillips, and a little bit later you may have Carl Davis, etc. And I don't see a lot of teams needing a nose tackle. I know the Browns do. I don't really know how many other teams do.
I think the one team that fell right in between the three teams that I mentioned, the New Orleans Saints, again, I don't expect them to move down a lot, but I think really, of those 4 or 5 teams picking behind us, I think really only the Saints are an option for Danny Shelton at that point. And honestly, in Rob Ryan's defense over there, I know he runs a lot of different schemes from a schematic point. He runs a lot of different formations, but I think they lack a true nose tackle at that position. I think you would really have to sell the Browns more so on the fact that if one of those big 3 receivers are still there, that, again, the Dolphins or the Niners are really ready to trade up and grab that, whether it's Devontae Parker, most likely it will be, or maybe even DGB at that point. I think it would be a little bit more tougher of a sell to really convince the Browns, like you mentioned, that the Saints, I think, is the only realistic option. I know the Texans are the next team down at 16. Well, they drafted Louis Nix III from Notre Dame last year, and they also signed the big boy from New England Patriots, Vince Wilfork. So they're out of the combo at that point. Chargers at 17. I don't see them, at least the Vikings, trading all the way down right off the get-go down to 17. So it would be a tough sell. You're right. I mean, it would be a tough sell to convince them, but don't put it out of the the realm of possibilities that the Saints could. I mean, again, you're looking at the Saints and what they've done so far this offseason. A lot of people trying to figure out what they're doing, what their game plan is. Are they trying to really go win one more Super Bowl with Drew Brees in the next 3 years? If so, then you're going to really have to go all in here in the next, I guess, year or two and grab some guys that can contribute right away, not any project picks anymore. Or are they rebuilding? I mean, they've got 5 picks, I believe, in the first 78 picks. So, I mean, they can do a lot of damage right here and go get the guys that they want. Danny Shelton, Saints not being known for their not only defense, but their physicality in their front 7. And again, I think, you mentioned a lot of great defensive tackles in this class, but I think a lot of people, if you need a pure nose tackle, I think the consensus is Danny Shelton is the guy. I mean, he's a guy who has been rumored to even possibly go as high as number 7 in the Chicago Bears, who in John Fox's defense, again, you need that one guy right in the middle who's going to eat up a lot of blockers and just really make everybody's job around him easier. So I'm with you, man. I think it would be a tough sell. I think the Saints are the only option there. I think more so they would be really selling the fact that, one of those other teams, Niners, Dolphins, want Devontae Parker, I think is because I think Kevin White and Amari Cooper should be gone at that point.
So looking at the second round, the Minnesota Vikings pick 45th, and a lot of these teams we're talking about, San Francisco is 46, Miami's 47, Cleveland's 43, New Orleans is 44. Arif and Luke, I guess specifically, what do you guys think the chances are that the Vikings trade out of the first round completely and aim for 2 consecutive or near consecutive picks in the second round?
I don't think that that's particularly likely, just given sort of the history of Rick Spielman's drafting. I know that so I think it was back in 2010 when they drafted Chris Cook and Toby Gerhart, if I remember correctly. Yep. They traded out of the first round entirely. That of course was at a time when Spielman A, isn't who he was now, and B, didn't really have the same authority that he has now. It sounds like he really likes these first round picks, in particular because of the fact that you can get them for 5 years instead of 3. And I think that that's sort of a big part of his draft strategy. It's why he trades up into the first round to secure some of those players, get them on the 5th-year option. He's mentioned that a couple of times. It's definitely in his mind. And I think even though he indicated that he thinks there's a flat talent distribution in this class, to him that flat talent distribution isn't 8 to 50. It's 8 to 20, and so you still kind of want that first round pick. Maybe grab the Cleveland's 5th round pick or Miami's 4th round pick or whatever. And then package whatever they grab to trade back up into the first round with pick 45. I think they're going to again attempt to trade out of the second round, but this time up. I don't think they're going to trade out of the first round entirely.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, again, just doesn't really fit his MO, his history. And like you mentioned, I mean, you get that 5th-year option, which a lot of kind of, on the surface fans, they don't really realize what big of an impact that has on the salary cap. You get to pay your quarterback, Teddy Bridgewater, rookie money for another year. You get to pay these guys, Xavier Rhodes, Harrison Smith, Sharif Floyd, all these guys, one more year of that rookie money. It's huge. It pays huge dividends when it comes to your salary cap and what you can go do then in free agency and re-signing basically locking these guys up for a long-term contract. You just have so much more flexibility. The other big thing is, Rick Spielman, you mentioned, he's not the guy who he was back then. He's a guy who targets a handful of guys, and he's willing to pay a little bit more just to go get them, just to make sure he goes and gets his guys. He doesn't want to sit around and risk the possibility that his guy could be gone by then. Not to say, again, that there isn't some good talent sitting there in the middle of the second round. I just don't think that it just fits his history or MO to sit around and wait for that opportunity because, again, he doesn't want to be stuck with that situation where his guy's gone at that point. Now I have to go to plan B or plan C. He's willing to just go get his guy and maybe pay a little bit more for that.
Yeah, I think one note about the way that Spielman drafts, I think based on sort of his pressers after the past couple of drafts, this most recent presser, he sort of really embodies how simple tier-based drafting can be, grouping guys into tiers, and then using the fact that you have guys basically graded equally to your advantage in terms of the way that you value draft picks and stuff like that, because it makes it simple for him. And, a lot of people don't like to think of, Rick Spielman and simple sort of as concepts that tie themselves together. But there are complex parts to the way that he organizes himself in the draft, consistently moving around and stuff like that. And there are simple parts to the way that he organizes himself in the draft. And I think that you're right. I think that if he finds out that there's a guy who is the only person left in his tier, and that's like sort of the best tier remaining available, that he's willing to maybe pay a little bit extra, like he did to New England for Cordero Patterson, like he did to Baltimore for Harrison Smith.
Harrison Smith, yep.
I think that he's willing to trade a little bit extra in order to get the last guy of a particular tier, because the drop off from that guy to the next guy, at least in the minds of the way that he drafts, is pretty significant. Which is why it was really simple to draft Sharif Floyd when he fell. It was not in the Vikings draft plans to do that. It was really simple to draft him. Then they drafted the guy that they wanted, Xavier Rhodes, and then they saw that the board was falling in a particular way. There's this only guy left, Cordero Patterson, so they traded up to get him. And I think that you're right. If a special talent drops to 11, I think that the Vikings are willing to entertain the idea of drafting him. And in my mind, that would be Vic Beasley, because he's the only player who is both probably special enough to be worth not getting some extra picks in the process and sacrificing, the integrity of sort of the 10-pick plan, and likely enough to fall based on the way that mock drafts have been going, based on positional need, etc. Because I don't see Leonard Williams falling. I don't see Amari Cooper falling. And I think that Amari Cooper's sort of in a class by himself. And so to me, he'd be special. And I don't see the Vikings obviously doing that for Mariota or Winston. So you talk about these high-tier guys. I think the only one that's likely to fall, maybe Dante Fowler, based on sort of all the trash that Twitter's given him in the past couple of days. But I think that, a special guy that could fall, probably the only one would be Vic Beasley. And that, I think, is the only time you could find an instance where that tier-based drafting prevents him from trading down. But it does provide him with a simple understanding of the way that he's going to evaluate talent. And it's something he mentioned with trading the 11th pick. He said, hey, there's a really good chance that, based on the fact that, guys 7 through 20 are very similar, they're all basically on the same tier. There's a very good chance that there are 3 or 4 players we have on the same tier that are at positions of need. We can trade down 3 or 4 spots and grab whoever's left of those players while grabbing a 5th round pick in the process, which I think, that's a really smart way of thinking it. You get basically the same player, at least in terms of the way the organization values this player and in terms of their talent level. You basically the same player plus another pick in the 5th round. And so thinking in that way allows you to make those kinds of moves. And I think it simplifies things for a person who likes to complexify the draft process.
How do you follow that? I mean, I got nothing.
I didn't even know complexify was a word.
I'm out, guys. Thanks a lot, guys.
Well, that's because Arif has spent a long time complexifying the English lange.
Well, just real quick, real quick, just to throw the cherry on top of that, I think you're right. I mean, Spielman is just so good at the analytical part of this, and I think it's something that goes a little bit unnoticed, but I think that, like you said, okay, I got 3 guys here. They're all the same to me value wise. Let me go try to steal a 5th rounder from somebody. Whereas other teams or GMs, I think they might get a little more emotionally attached during the interview process and really fall in love with this one guy. Oh my gosh, he's so great. Let's go get this guy right here. Where Spielman, I can never see him really doing that in the process. If I got 3 guys all ranked similar, why wouldn't I go try to trade down? It's just a numbers game with him at all times. He doesn't really let any type of emotions get involved with him and the drafting process whatsoever, which is something that really goes unnoticed and something that doesn't really get a lot of attention because it's tough to know what GM or coaching or scouting staff is falling in love with a guy during the interview process. How we don't have access to anything like that, but I can just imagine Rick being very, again, black and white with the numbers, analytical wise, whereas some other GMs, maybe some guys who haven't had good success in the draft, I'm looking at you, Ray Farmer, over there in Cleveland, get a little bit maybe emotionally attached with some prospects, and that comes back to haunt them, and that really comes back to hurt them because you don't ever reach that full value when you get maybe emotionally attached to one guy during that interview process or pre-draft process. So I think you're right.
Well, that was something else that Spielman touched on but didn't belabor in the presser, was that he has like some outside analytics guys, and he believes that the Vikings are doing some very interesting things, quote unquote, with analytics, #analytics.
Was it the Vikings had taken a step forward or something like that? Was the exact quote
forward,
from the
yeah.
So, I mean, he obviously didn't want to talk about exactly what the details of that were. He wasn't going to let a bunch of press yahoos brain rape him. But do you guys have any insight as to, I guess, maybe where the special guys drop off in the draft this season, or where the talent floor might be, at least in the first couple of rounds?
I can say this. It's tough to answer that. That's a tough question because, a lot of it really comes down to the eye of the beholder. I mean, this is a draft where, unlike last year or some years in the past, that, you've got that cream of the crop, can't miss, almost Hall of Fame-ish prospects like the Andrew Lucks and guys like that. Whereas this year, you don't see that quite as rich at the top. But again, guys, I'm 10 to 25, all kind of rank similar, about the same. So I've read, scenarios where this is one of those drafts where it's like one team could have a guy ranked 8, another team could have him ranked 48. There's just so much in the eye of the beholder in this draft, and I think it's tough to really rank, as a whole, from the NFL's perspective, guys and where their tiers are at and where those kind of big drop-offs are at. I can say this again, looking at 10 through 25, maybe 10 through 30, 35, there's a lot of good guys, and when you mentioned us maybe staying put at pick 45. I'm trying to think about the talent that could be available, and there's some solid, definitely day one potential starters in that area. But I think, again, with just Rick Spielman's MO, he would rather not risk it and just go get his guy, whoever that may be, and maybe, again, pay a little bit more for it. But it's tough to say, again, the rankings or tiers, because I think in this draft in particular, everybody's is going to be a little different.
Plus, let's remind ourselves that Chip Kelly is still going to be taking picks. He's not done yet.
That's right.
The man has not set Philly on fire yet.
Now, I will say one thing to keep in mind is that one of the things that he emphasized in the presser, and I think it's something that he kind of mentioned last year, although it was sort of harder to understand because at the time he had drafted Anthony Barr, and so it was kind of difficult to see how this could be true. But it was really important to find schematic fits for what Zimmer does, and I think a lot of fans are really attached to this idea that you design your scheme around your players. You don't, grab players for your scheme. To an extent that's true, but I think that virtually no coaches do this, and in fact, some of the most successful don't, right? And you like Bill Belichick, for example, expressly drafts players specifically for his scheme, and he's very adaptable and he moves his scheme around, but he drafts players specifically for his scheme. And I think the reason for that is because a scheme, a set of rules for how your defense operates, is a very sort of touchy, delicate thing, and you can't just throw in a player who's very good at another thing, ask him to do that other thing, and don't expect the integrity of all of these other things to match. And I think maybe the most basic example, and you could go down 10 levels of complexity for this, but the most basic example is finding the best man-to-man corner you can, because he's just the best person on your draft board, in a scheme that centers mostly around zone defense, right? Or for example, Alteron Werner, for example, was the highest-rated cornerback in free agency. Can you imagine if Seattle went after Alteron Werner and then adjusted their scheme for Alteron Werner, a cover two corner? Like, that doesn't and you just can't do that. And I think people like this idea that you design your scheme around your players, because that's what smart coaches do. When sort of the history of smart coaches is varied. A lot of coaches did that. A lot of coaches did not do that. A lot of very successful coaches now do not do that. And when you do that, you have a set of rules that account for every contingency. So, for example, when they invented the 2-gap 3-4, there was a lot of moving parts. When Jimmy Johnson switched to a 4-3 under, there was a lot of moving parts, and everybody had to change, and a whole new set of players had to come in. So it wasn't really sort of the same thing. That's one thing to take into account. There are special players in this draft that Spielman may not consider just because they're not scheme fits for the offense or defense. That's, in fact, my biggest worry about, let's say, if Amari Cooper falls, that I would love him on a team. I think that he can fit any scheme, but there's a good argument that maybe he doesn't fit sort of the Coryell. Maybe actually he probably fits most Coryell offenses, but maybe the Turner brand of a Coryell offense to the point where he wouldn't be a target, which that would upset me a lot. But I can see sort of you take some really good players off of the board for that reason. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that the talent may drop off at different levels for different GMs based on what their schematic requirements are, what they have the ability to be flexible with, what they can't be flexible with, etc. I mean, in order to expand the potential pool of players that could fit their scheme, I mean, Spielman mentioned they looked at 13 of those hybrid defensive end / linebacker, generally edge rusher type players, and out of those 13, they will down the list, they wouldn't say to how many, would actually be a fit within Zimmer's scheme, because again, it's not a 3-4 scheme, it's not a hybrid scheme by any means. A lot of people thought it might be hybrid, that you might have a 3-4 and 4-3 looks. Not really. It's just basically a 4-3 with occasionally a defensive end 2-gapping. A rush linebacker doesn't do much for being a pure rush linebacker. Jarvis Jones would never succeed, for example, in a Mike Zimmer defense, or arguably anywhere. But you take a look at maybe Vic Beasley, who's sort of this edge rusher. Maybe he can play linebacker. I think that he can. You take a look at Randy Gregory. Maybe he can play linebacker. There's definitely good arguments on both sides for whether or not Randy Gregory can do that at his weight. That may be better for him to play an off-ball linebacker. You take a look at Alvin Dupree, who has the athleticism probably to play linebacker. I'm not so sure that he can from an instinct perspective. Take a look at a lot of these tweeners. Dante Fowler, very, very likely can play linebacker. And yeah, I think that, you have to take that into account when you talk about sort of where talent drops off at different tiers, because there's even the possibility that a talent that other people should and do rate highly is maybe a third-round talent on your board, just because, they may be a special player, but in our scheme, he'd probably be as good as a typical third-round pick. And so it's nice to have this kind of player's versatility, but I mean, there's only so much I can do with like a 230-pound pass rusher.
Right, and I think, really at the end, talent trumps a lot of the scheme fit. I mean, if you think a guy can adjust to a certain aspect or to a certain degree without completely, 180ing their whole game, I think, at a certain point, like you said, talent is going to trump that, and you're going to pull the trigger on a guy like that. Amari Cooper, for example, like you mentioned, although I think it's a moot point, I think he'll be long gone by pick 11. I think, he's a guy that's so talented in so many areas, you got to be able to pull the trigger and be confident in that decision and say that he can thrive in this, scheme or this offensive game plan. Getting a little bit deeper with Amari Cooper specifically, I just don't think he complements what you already have on the roster in the fact that what you need and what you currently have. I think he already kind of meshes with what Charles Johnson and Mike Wallace kind of bring to the table. Certainly he does a lot of other things better than those guys, but I think they're still after a big target that you can really go attack the ball when it's in the air, a guy that's going to stretch the field vertically, a red zone threat in that aspect. That's why I think Devontae Parker actually makes more sense, even if Cooper was on the board with, again, what they're trying to do and how they complement the guys on the roster. But, just from a schematic standpoint, it's tough to sit here and say which guys would really thrive in a Mike Zimmer defense as opposed to what guys wouldn't. Just at the surface, for some kind of, on the surface fans that maybe have just started to research and get into this, maybe mock drafts and player rankings, things like that. A guy like Landon Collins, he had a lot of buzz right away, the clear-cut #1 safety in the draft. You start to do some more research and due diligence, though, and he's really a one-dimensional safety. He's kind of in the box, run-stopping safety. He's going to struggle if you have to put him in deep center field or man him up on a slot receiver or tight end. And a guy like Landon Collins, who initially a lot of Vikings fans are, would this be a guy that really fits? I don't think so, because I just think his one-dimensionalness at that point is going to restrict the guy opposite of him, Harrison Smith, to really have to play center field and center field only, when really you want, at least in Zimmer's defense, I think across the NFL now, there's not so much the free safety, strong safety label. Is you really got to be able to do both. You really got to be able to mix and match, and that's what's nice about Harrison Smith. He can thrive in both areas, but you don't want to limit him to just one specific position. Shaq Thompson, another guy I worry about, again, a guy linked to, a lot of Vikings combos. I just don't think, just in general, he's going to be a great off-the-ball linebacker. He's a tweener. What do you got to do? You got to move him to safety then? Or what's the deal? What do you have to do? Is he a sub-package type of player? I worry about investing an early-round pick. Those are two guys that, at least early in the process, were linked to the Minnesota Vikings as possible selections. And I just don't think, scheme-wise, and I'm just worried about them just in general transitioning to the NFL. They may be a little limited to their roles, and if they could be an actual 3-down player. So if that's ever the case, and you ever got to start to ask yourself those questions, it's risky to even think about investing a first-round or day one pick on those kind of guys. So those are kind of two guys that just float to the surface for me when I think about maybe some guys that might not fit well with the Vikings, or just in general in the NFL, because you really got to find out what they're going to do, what they're going to be for your team, and try to maximize their talents, even if it is only a sub-package role or maybe a 2-down type of role or player. there. So tough to say exactly, again, what guys maybe fit Zimmer's scheme the best or Norv's scheme the best. Maybe Arif, you could answer that a little bit better, but it's tough for me to say. I know I could limit some guys out of that, maybe cross some names off the list, but it's tough to hone in because, again, if you got the talent, then you should be able to find a spot for this guy and, just eventually just let him rip. Just let him go play football.
So, NFL Network analyst Charlie Casserly hates it when this happens. Genuinely hates it. But we thrive on unexpectedly giving our hosts and guests the opportunity to form a circular firing squad and ask unexpected questions of each other. So I guess Luke and Arif, do you have any draft strategy related questions for each other before we dive into our final draft mailbag? I only mention it now because one of the questions in the mailbag kind of dovetails neatly with what Luke was just saying, but I wanted to give you guys a chance to snipe at each other before we let our readers take a shot.
Well, I'll just fling one out, right off the bat. I mean, nothing really, and don't worry, not a brain stumper or anything, but it's a legitimate question that I'm curious about, a guy that does so much research like yourself, what you think of this scenario to play out, offensive lineman. It's been noted that it's likely a position that needs to be addressed, specifically the left guard spot. I read a stat that O-linemen have accounted for like 20% of all first-round picks the last 5 drafts, and that's easily the highest percentage of any position. Say a guy like Brandon Scherff falls there at number 11, arguably one of the safest picks, if not the safest pick in the draft, if you want to move him inside to that guard position. Is that similar to maybe like an Amari Cooper where the talent's just too good to pass up, even though plan A was to probably trade down and stockpile draft picks? Is a guy like Brandon Scherff, if he falls to you at 11, you're the GM in the war room, are you going to pull the trigger on a guy like that not only can come in right away and be a day one starter inside, but fill a need as well, kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone? What would kind of your gut say if a guy like Brandon Scherff fell to you at 11?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts on this, and I think actually we can before we get to the mailbag expand on one of those thoughts, which is sort of the use of analytics in the realm of drafting. But one of the things that Spielman mentioned when he talked about the way that they use data to analyze the draft is and in fact I think actually a reporter brought it up. Is that one of the things that they take a look at is positional value by round and sort of what rounds it makes the most sense to invest in a particular position. And I think we all sort of know what Spielman's thoughts are when it comes to interior offensive linemen, which is not before the 5th round. We'll draft 1 or 2 every year, and one of them's going to hit every couple of years, and that's all we need. Yep. And so, obviously, if Spielman was the one answering this question, A, he wouldn't answer it, but B, he probably would not take Scherff. And I think that he thinks that even though Brandon Sheriff's a quote unquote special talent, even if his own team rates him that highly, I think that one of the things he also considered was the nature of depth. I think he thinks that the nature of depth in any draft class is such that another team is going to value Scherff much more than we will, and is therefore willing to entertain a trade to any one of these teams that needs to trade up for a guard. Probably not the Browns, but I think certainly the Saints, given sort of the cap casualties they'll have to deal with in the next couple of years, and the fact that I think they got rid of Ben Grubbs. They got rid of at least one of their guards, and they wanted to get rid of, I think, Jari Evans, the other one. This could help them set up for the long term. The Saints could be one. I think the Dolphins could be one if they're not huge fans of Billy Turner and his development. That sort of thing. And so I think that they see more value in a trade. Me personally, I would love to do it, and I actually think that Scherff has the ability to kick out to tackle, and not because of what he did in 2014. I think that film is not very friendly to a person who wants to play tackle at the NFL level, although I wouldn't say he necessarily would be bad at it. It's more that he would be pretty phenomenal as a guard.
Right.
But I think that his 2013 tape is actually really good for playing tackle. Not that he had extraordinary amount of foot quickness, but that his punch off the snap was so good, so powerful, so well timed and well placed. It was very difficult for speed rushers to do very much against him. And I think the difference here is that he had a knee surgery in week 2 of the college season, and then he, didn't even miss, more than one practice for, which it's mind-boggling to me, even if it's just a scope, right? It's mind-boggling to me that someone can have a knee injury, which he had, and a knee surgery, which he had, and play every game of the season. And I think it sort of affects his tape in a way that prevents us from seeing some of the things that he can be good at, which includes being a tackle. With that in mind, I think that a player like Sheriff's even more valuable because it provides you with the kind of insurance for Matt Khalil that you really want. Because what if Khalil continues his level of underperformance, right? What if Khalil continues to get actually knee injuries, right? Either one of those two things would be a reason to sort of move on from him, right? And play Sheriff at guard for 1 year while maybe Yankee, generates more strength or develops, or they can fully evaluate him, and then play Sheriff at tackle without having to invest a draft pick, a year from now at that position in probably a class next year that's going to have better top tier talents at tackle, like Ronnie Stanley, but I don't think probably has the depth at tackle. And if the Vikings are planning on winning, which I'm sure they are, and they have to pick in the 20s, they may not be able to get a top tier tackle. So you could do that. And then I think sort of one more thing with regards to that. One thing that Spielman said at almost the very beginning of the presser, when he talked about what could happen at pick 11, he did say, he rattled off a litany of positions, like what if this DB falls? What if this pass rusher falls? What if this blank falls? And I think he said, what if this offensive lineman falls? We're looking at 2 offensive linemen. So that's something I think, he said that, right? Or rather, there's multiple offensive linemen we're looking at. And I think that is an indication that they are willing to invest a pick in an offensive lineman if they fall. Maybe that's not Sheriff. Maybe that's Andrus Peat, who the NFL has rated as probably their number 1 tackle, even though a lot of draft enthusiasts don't see the same thing.
Yeah, just from a pure value standpoint, I know you mentioned, I think, again, we're just trying to just really get in the head of Rick Spielman, what his MO is, what his history is, and what he likes to do, his tendencies in the draft, and you nailed it. He's all about trying to just throw some darts up on the board, the 5th, 6th, 7th round, a couple guards, some interior linemen, John Sullivan, 6th rounder, Brandon Fusco, 6th rounder, and as good as Sheriff is, and again, combine that with it would fill a giant need at left guard. I'm with you. I don't think he would pull the trigger. I think he would likely find a trade suitor or trade partner and try to get some sort of value and move down a couple spots and grab a couple extra picks. And I think a lot of the mainstream Vikings fans are going to be shocked to hear that, because they're going to say, well, again, it fills a huge need. He's an all-pro potential left guard. He's one of the safest picks in the draft, but it just doesn't really fit, again, the value. You can go look at the list, and there's guys down the list. You could get down to, guards 8 through 12, whoever that may be on your board, Robert Myers, Tennessee State, Jose Matias, Florida State, Quandro, Lincoln Tomlinson, Trey Jackson, Ali Marpet. There's a lot of them, and although some of those guys are going to go a lot higher than the 5th round, I think the point is that it just doesn't fit his MO to really grab that specific position that early in the draft. So I think, like Cooper, like we mentioned earlier, I think it's a moot point. I think he could go as high as number 5 to the Washington Redskins, who I think Jay Gruden in that run option offense really should start to try to solidify that running game. And you do that by grabbing a guy like Sheriff, who's arguably the best run blocker in this draft. And that helps everybody, the running game, whether it's RG3 back there doing the run options or what. So I don't think he'll be there at 11. I just wanted to get your take, though, and I think I agree. I think you're right. I think they would try to likely move out of that spot and take advantage of a guy that a lot of people didn't think would fall, and take advantage of that value, so to speak, and maybe garnish a couple extra, a little bit more higher picks from a team like you mentioned, the Saints or maybe even the Dolphins.
Yeah.
Well, and that's like literally what they did with Teddy Bridgewater. They didn't expect him to fall, but he did, and so we scooped him up, cashed in.
Right.
By the way, Reef, are you going to be at Winter Park this year?
Hell yeah, and Luke's going to be with me.
Carpool.
One of you sounds more excited about the carpool than the other.
I gotta go, guys. It's a Taurus. It's a great gas mileage.
You're gonna stop at Super America. You're gonna get big sodas.
Yep,
the big gulps, over to the
beef jerky.
Gonna head over to the CD section and get a CD, and then go to the car and realize it doesn't have a CD player, and like motor down the road,
right,
all the way down to Eden Prairie.
God, that is just scary accurate. Wow.
See, I think of them like them and like two of their like drafty buddies piling into somebody's Jeep like the scene in Zoolander.
I was thinking of that scene in Zoolander this entire conversation.
Yeah. Well, great minds think alike, but ours apparently do as well.
As long as no one dies in a freak gasoline fight, I suppose we can we can allow that.
Save the gas fights, idiot.
but why male models? So I guess the my question is how high are you going to jump, Arif, when Rick Spielman's in the middle of a presser about the pick that he had for the first round, and he goes, "Wait, we'll be right back. We have to do something."
Sprints out of the presser. I can't wait. I mean, just again, I mean, would you really bet against that happening? I can't. I mean, I wouldn't. Again, just looking at his history.
An amazing moment when
I wish I was there. I wish that would be pretty. Here's the kicker. I mean, here's the wild card. Just see what kind of shoes he's wearing, and if he's got those, Nike pumps or New Balances on or something, you can tell he's ready to sprint out of there and jump back in the war room.
Spielman muss spiel. There's not much more to it than that.
So one thing I wanted to touch on is I mean this is something that's super dear to my heart. It's an overused word, and I think the word got beaten to death in the presser. The idea of analytics in the draft process, it's something that Spielman maybe brought up the word 40 times, although I don't think that's necessarily his fault. I think a lot of people were just asking him about it because it's sort of the hot new thing to talk about.
#analytics.
And if we had just said data tools or information analysis or even studies, I think it wouldn't have drawn as much. Interest from the reporters.
But then I can say stuff like, "Hey, Arif, you're a data tool,"
or we can, or say something along the lines of expensive Cleveland PowerPoints.
So we had Kyle Shanahan put together a 32-slide PowerPoint on who he thinks should not hire him. I think
I didn't know where you're going to go with that, and you nailed it.
But I think one thing that people get stuck on is what analytics are, and it doesn't help that we start using it as this like object noun. So for example, Spielman said like we have an analytic for this and an analytic for this, instead of saying we've studied this and we've studied that. And a lot of people, when they think about it in the context of football, they think of basically two things. One, what to do with timeouts and fourth downs. That's one. And two, what players are good. And the realm of data tools and new data in the NFL is so much broader. And Spielman touched on all of those things, and people still were like, yeah, so workout numbers are pretty cool, right? And, obviously they can provide us information that we didn't have previously. They could talk about sort of maybe unlockable talent that we didn't have the ability to fully access when we watched the tape, that sort of stuff. And he talked about that. He talked about how Jerick McKinnon, that pick was driven in part, sort of by analytical indicators for success. But he talked about so many things. He talked about psychological profiles, which, by the way, aren't just used in player evaluation and player projection, which he did mention, but also used in figuring out how to coach players, which is like sort of an underrated part of all the psychological testing that the NFL does for their draft prospects. I mean, he talked about how their psychological tests and their psych consultants come up with about 10 different dimensions of analysis. It sounds like an eHarmony commercial. 13 dimensions of personality. So 10 different dimensions of analysis. He mentioned 3 of them, I think: social maturity, aggression, coachability, those things. But a lot of those tools, a lot of those consultants don't just tell you which players maybe can provide you with sort of the best atmosphere in a locker room, and that doesn't necessarily mean sort of the most polite or deferential players. You want aggressive players too, which is part of the reason that Spielman mentioned that those are weighted differently for the different positions. I mean, if your running back's not aggressive, I don't really know what you're doing. It also tells you sort of maybe the best way to reach those players and coach those players, because it tells you sort of what they respond to and what they don't respond to. Marcus Peters, for example, he's a really talented cornerback, and he has some problems with constraint and authority, both of those things. But in particular, when authority constrains him. I mean, you can even see this on the field. He's a bit of a freelancer outside of the scheme at Washington, which is fine. He did a fantastic job. Even when he did do that. But he sort of rebelled against the conformity that Peterson brought, that Sarkisian didn't really want at Washington. And Peters is considered to be not coachable, but he's actually probably a very coachable player if you do not, figure out what makes him tick. And, analytics in the context of psych testing can help you figure that out, not just which players you want to grab, but how to coach the players that you have grabbed. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is, we talked about, position by draft value. Spielman mentioned also there's sweet spots in the draft. That's another, aspect of it. Figuring out which injuries are likely to recur, which ones are not likely to recur. That's a big part of it. There's so many uses of this concept of data analysis that when we say analytics, I think we just sort of blind ourselves to thinking about Kirk Goldsberry charts on Kobe's shot percentage from different parts of the court, or combine metrics, when it's really, there's so many things, and it's not just player evaluation. It's how to use the players you have. It's how to figure out how to move around in the draft. It's sort of what positions are important. It's, all sorts of things. And Spielman mentioned all of these things, and a lot of people kind of got caught up on the word analytics, which means they got caught up on the player evaluation side of it, which is why most of my mentions on Twitter, when I talked about, or when I basically I just re-regurgitated Spielman on Twitter, a lot of people were like, well, the film matters, which is, by the way, something Spielman said. When, the film does matter in the context of player evaluation, and that's only one dimension of the kind of studies that Spielman is performing. The film is not that useful for figuring out whether or not the 11th pick is better than the 14th pick plus a 5th. So,
is it entirely possible this is all actually part of a paid commercial through UPS and the league? Like, the UPS airs all sorts of commercials during the league. During league games about analytics and logistics. Is it entirely possible that this is actually just part of some GM word of the day calendar?
Some subliminal message we don't know, that we're just being brainwashed for UPS.
Yeah, the Vikings are just going to start shipping now.
Right.
That's all we're going to be doing.
Right.
It's synergistic.
Is it possible that this is all a dream?
Possible, but unlikely, I think, is the consensus of the philosophy world.
This podcast has discussed what color a mirror is, so I don't think anything's too far.
Touche.
Well, and let us never forget the metaphysical implications of a fake Heisman Trophy versus a real one.
Well, okay, I don't want to get back into that discussion.
Yeah.
Hey, real quick though,
let
me ask you just about Marcus Peters, because I'm very high on this kid, and I know the one thing really holding him back on a lot of draft boards, and he may be wiped off completely on some draft boards, is some off the field issues, how he can be coached, some temperament stuff and whatnot. From your research and getting into the analytical department, is this a guy that is, I guess, just as plain and simple as this? Is he a possibility for the Minnesota Vikings, knowing what Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer like to do on defense?
It's unusual because if you take a look at sort of some of the analytical markers of success that the Vikings have historically used, at least in this past draft, if not a couple of drafts, Marcus Peters' workout numbers are not great. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I would hold that against him in the same way I held Trey Waynes' poor workout numbers against him, which is kind of a weird thing to say given his 4.3 140, but it was a poor workout. I wouldn't hold that against him just because he was out of football for so long. And if a player runs slower on the field than his 40 time, for example, I don't really mind that, because to me the 40 time indicates unlockable talent. The player needs to figure out how to put that speed on the field, because players have done that before, where they were slow in college, but they ran a fast 40 and suddenly they're fast in the NFL. I mean, that's happened, right? But if you're fast on the field and run a poor 40, I think it's much more likely that you're a fast player than a slow player. And I think Peters is maybe not a blazer, right? I mean, he's never going to be as fast as Trey Waynes, right? He's not going to be as fast as Byron Jones, but he's certainly faster than I think the average cornerback. Maybe not by much, right? But faster than the average cornerback. And certainly his fluidity scores do not match the tape that he put together, I think, in his time at Washington, because his agility scores were actually really bad. And you wouldn't expect that based on what you saw at Washington. So I think in that context, these workout numbers may not matter. And when you can discount some of these workout numbers, I think a lot of the analytical case against Marcus Peters, I think a lot of that goes away, because I think if you take a look at some of the other kinds of potential analytics you could take a look at, maybe your share of pass deflections, your share of interceptions. You could take a look at, how many times they were targeted or the passer rating they gave up, that sort of thing, all of which are small, I think, pieces to the puzzle, because defensive statistics are not as good as offensive statistics for predicting future success. But still, those tools are very, very high on Marcus Peters as a player. And then I think, you mentioned that he might be off of a couple of boards. I think Middlekauff tweeted that too. He's a former scout. I think he's like an Oakland area guy now, but he worked for the Eagles, and I think he worked for the Raiders too. But Middlekauff tweeted that out. But at the same time, Lance Zierlein of NFL.com, he was on a radio show about a week ago, and he said very few teams, if any, that he's talked to have taken Marcus Peters not only off their board, but have even scratched him for character concerns at all. You take a look at Nolan Naraki's 2015 NFL Draft Guide book, and Naraki used to, be at Pro Football Weekly, and then he also was at NFL.com. He is, for better or worse, extremely well connected. He's also the same guy that criticized Cam Newton's smile, but he's at least well connected to the NFL community, and he's reflective of a lot of NFL scouting culture. And normally they hate players who have conflicts with coaches. I mean, you can take a look at Marquez Wilson, dismissed from Washington State after a conflict with Mike Leach. I think also an immensely talented player, maybe not in the same realm as Peters, but I think he went in the 7th round because of the conflicts that he had with a coach who has historically had tons of conflicts with players, including an allegation that he may have choked a player, or twice maybe did that.
But as far as off the field issues go, it's not like he's failing a drug test or being caught.
Right, but that's my point. A lot of scouts hate players who have conflicts with coaches more than they hate players who beat women or have these off the field drug concerns, because drug concerns only matter if they take you if they force you to be suspended or whatever, which is becoming more likely in sort of today's NFL that a drug issue is going to get you suspended. But for the most part, they care more about if you don't get along with coaches. They care about that in terms of their talent acquisition strategies much more than they care about sort of your moral fiber, which is reflected in sort of these arrests and all these other things. And so Marquez Wilson dropped a lot more for his conflict with coaches than maybe a similarly, because I thought Marcus Wilson was maybe a 2nd round, 3rd round, I think a high 2nd round actually, sort of receiver. And if you take a look at another 2nd round player, Everson Griffin, who had all sorts of off-field problems, but was coachable. I mean, he was super immature. He was a huge liability. You didn't even know if he was going to see the field at USC. He's a 2nd round talent, and he went in the 4th, right? And I think that sort of might be reflective of that. So that it is interesting that, given that both Naraki and Zierlein have talked to people who have said they haven't dinged him at all for character at all. Not even not taking him off the board, but dinged him at all for character. I think it's really demonstrative of what NFL coaches think of Coach Peterson and his interactions with players. And so I think Marcus Peters is actually probably is not as much of a character risk as people are assuming.
Well, all right then. I don't know, that kind of wraps it up, right? Like, is there?
Well, we got the mailbag.
Oh, I mean, yeah, not the show, but I guess that part of the discussion.
Get ahead of yourself, Dustin.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. I was just curious. Again, I mean, I think a guy that again, some people have him as the number one corner, but again, maybe a liability off the field. What do we have to worry about? And I know before that we were discussing just the analytics and how coachable some guys could be. And just the progress I think of teams and their due diligence and really narrowing it down of again how well they're going to be able to be coached, like you mentioned, at the next level, with a lot more nuances going on and a lot more distractions and different factors and things like that. So yes, you definitely went above and beyond and answered my question about Marcus Peters. And again, but I think that again, I mean, all the talent is there. Very interesting though to hear that that he has not been dinged too much with those off the field concerns, because again, obviously maybe from an athletic or physical standpoint there are some some limitations, I guess you could say, but for the most part I think it was the immaturity, the off the field incidents, or maybe more so in the locker room incidences that seem to be I guess from a stereotype holding him back. So just good to hear that that may not be the case inside some of these war rooms come Thursday.
Oh, and one story about Marcus Peters before we move on. So the week after he was dismissed from the Washington program, he was texting all the defensive backs about the game plan and giving them advice, including the person who replaced him on the on the starting roster. So he gave them advice. He went through the game plan. He went through the film with them actually, and provided them with advice. I mean, I've heard that teammates love him. So yeah.
Well, and there's been room for people with these kind of issues, like people with that strange combination of top talent and coachability or locker room issues before. I mean, Percy Harvin, we know him well. He bounced around the league for a while, despite being very talented and difficult to coach. Randy Moss, another example, but there is no precedent for it, I guess.
Right.
So shall we mailbag then? That seems like the next logical step, I think. Josh Dungan 1, the legend, writes us with a 3-part question, which was, the first part was mostly answered. Who are not fits for schemes with the Vikings? We talked about how that's a kind of a difficult thing to predict and maybe not the most important thing to look for in a draftee. But the other 2 parts of his question, who are players that the Vikings should specifically avoid in the draft? And then after that, what are your respective wide receiver rankings and your feelings on Perriman in particular?
I think I'm only going to throw one name onto the Vikings should avoid this guy list. Trey Waynes, man, he is a very talented cornerback who does nothing at Michigan State that he'd be doing in Minnesota, and vice versa. He's so talented, and he's just not a scheme fit. He's a phenomenal scheme fit for Seattle, for Jacksonville, for Atlanta, for Pittsburgh, even, and to some extent Arizona. But I just don't see him as a very good fit, and I don't think that the things that he's bad at are easy to coach out of him. So to me, Trey Waynes is a quote unquote must avoid. But out of the other top picks, I can't think of anyone off the top of my head that's being mocked highly that the Vikings necessarily need to avoid, although I'm not a huge fan of adding Randy Gregory to the roster.
Yeah, I think Trey Waynes, I mean, you nailed it. You had an awesome article just stating exactly what you just said about he's going to be good for somebody. It's just not going to be us. And I mentioned earlier, Landon Collins, Shaq Thompson, just guys on the surface that I just don't think fit very well with what we need and who, how they're going to complement us, maybe some more sub-package roles and things like that. Just not some guy that you want to invest a early round, a day 1 first round pick on some of those guys.
Yeah, and I think you and I stand in a little bit of opposition when it comes to Shaq Thompson, because I think of him as a guy who could be who has Telvin Smith in him. Telvin Smith from Florida State.
Yeah, a little underweight. Yep.
And I know that Smith went in the third round, if I remember correctly, to Jacksonville. And I also know that his film is a lot better than Thompson's. I know both of those things are true of him when it comes to being a will linebacker. But the reason that I'm high on Thompson, I think, is because once he figures out, or once coaches tell him what position he is, I think he can be really good, because I think a lot of what held him back from a film perspective as a linebacker is the fact that he literally played the safety position at Washington on maybe a third of his snaps. I mean, it depends on what game you look at. I mean, right. I think, against like Oregon State, he played linebacker a lot more often, for example. But I think a lot of his reactiveness is a result of being a safety, where safeties have to sort of wait for the play to develop, because I thought he showed flashes, or not even just flashes, like some phenomenal instincts in reading plays before they happen. I think that, the reason his tackle numbers and tackle for loss numbers are so low is because, he played high, sort of maybe 8 yards back instead of 4 yards back on a lot of snaps. He played over the slot. I mean, he covered slot receivers a lot, and not just tight ends, but slot receivers a lot. And when you do that, you don't get very high tackle numbers. And so I think those are reasons I think he could fit in as a will, and only as a will, linebacker in Zimmer's scheme or many other schemes. And Zimmer's, historically had two big linebackers like Mauluga and Burfict, and a tiny dude like Demanche or Lemur or first round pick Keith Rivers. And sort of the least tiny dude he's had playing the stack linebacker position was Chad Greenway, who is listed at 242 pounds. I believe he lost weight to be closer to 240. And I think a lot of scouts think that Shaq Thompson can get up to 235, which is the weight that Keith Rivers played at. It's above the weight that Demanche played at, etc. So I think that Thompson can be a very good fit. In fact, I think that what he provides can be rare enough that you could give him a first-round grade. But given sort of his value, I wouldn't pick him in the first round, because I think that you can pick him and other athletic linebackers in the second round, because I think that the market for linebackers is skewed, and I think people are undervaluing them in general.
Yeah, tough to argue with that take, just because, again, I mean, I really hone in on the value part of it, right? You mentioned Telvin Smith, third-round pick. If you can give me Shaq Thompson in the third round, I'm going to take that all day. Just again, you touched on it. Instincts are out of this world. Very productive, very versatile. It's just the unknown. I think you're a little bit more comfortable with him being an off-the-ball linebacker as a will, a little bit more than I am, but I'm not going to argue with the fact that, again, he is productive and very instinctive, and I think like you mentioned, if you give him one specific position to hone in on and sit there and learn, I think he will grow into eventually. It might take 2 or 3 years, and maybe for him to bulk up a little bit more than what he's at now. Although he'll never be like you mentioned that like Avantez Burfict or Ray Maluga, anything like that. He will be that smaller, more athletic, more instinctive guy. But I think that it's just a little bit of the unknown that worries me. And when I think of him, I always see a little bit more of a guy that Zimmer would move around a little bit, a guy that he would have a little bit too much fun experimenting with, and some sub packages, so 3-3-5 almost formation, and maybe move him as like a third safety and stuff. I see Zimmer almost having too much fun toying with him and getting a little too cute at times, and that could just be me, maybe overthinking it. And again, I think for that aspect, you want to give me in the third round, I'm going to take that all day. When you're talking about maybe trading back up like Rick does, who's he going to grab? If he grabs a guy like Shaq Thompson, I would be a little worried off the bat. But at the end of the day, obviously, whoever they pick, they're going to be more than comfortable, obviously. They've obviously done more than their due diligence in that aspect. And so they're obviously comfortable with whoever they pick. And if that is Shaq Thompson, say at the end of round 1, then obviously they know a lot more than I do at that point. And they're going to be a lot more comfortable and have a game plan ready for what they're going to do with that guy. So the instincts are out the charts. And again, I mean, he won the Paul Horngun Award for most versatile player in the whole country. As you mentioned, he played safety a third of his snaps, linebacker a handful, and then obviously running back on the other side. I think he was 1,000-yard rusher. So he's a football player, man. He's a football player. You just got to find and I think hone in on one thing for him at the next level, and that's just the unknown that that worries me for a first round pick. That's all.
Yeah, no, and I think a big part of being a GM sometimes is saving your coaches from themselves. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Also, considering the full disclosure of this being Arif is willing to draft anyone who could potentially replace Chad Greenway.
True. Bias. He's low. Yeah, that's true.
Like, let's not forget. Let us not forget.
Wait, you don't like Greenway? Wait a minute. You don't like,
I love Greenway.
Wait a minute. You don't like
be playing football for the Minnesota Vikings. No, it also, we should probably get to the second part of this question, which is to rank these wide receivers. Luke, I think you've done a little bit more study of the wide receivers, which is why I'll let you sort of do cleanup work and bat second on this one. But I'm going to rank my wide receivers and talk about why I have them valued a little bit differently than some other people, and talk about Rashad Perriman a bit. And then you can disagree with me to your heart's content. You'll probably be right. So I've got Amari Cooper 1. I've already talked about why I think he's a complete receiver. I think that his ceiling is extraordinarily underrated. He's very fast, which is, some people are like, well, he's not a speed guy. He's just, an agility guy, which is not true. He's very fast. Someone compared him to Odell Beckham, which is not fair, first. And second, maybe not true because he doesn't have the same vertical leap that Odell Beckham does, but sort of the other parts of the game make a lot of sense. He's very agile, he's very fast, he's an extremely good route runner, etc. So he's my number 1. My number 2, actually, I'm low on Kevin White. My number 2 is actually Devontae Parker. Even though I have a lot of concerns about his game, I think that he needs to bulk up, and I think he needs to play more physical, and I don't think he runs very good routes a lot of the time, but I think a lot of that stems from his foot injury. I thought he had sharper cuts last year or 2 years ago than this last year, and I think that's reflective of his foot injury. So I think that his weaknesses are a little bit hidden by that, or exacerbated by that. And then Kevin White I have third, because he's not a typical West Virginia wide receiver, and he does a lot of things. And though he doesn't run many routes, what he does run, he runs well, which is kind of surprising. And then after that, I think the consensus, I've got the consensus board in front of me, actually. The consensus has it Jalen Strong, Rashad Perriman, and Dorial Green-Beckham. And none of those guys are my next guy. My next guy is actually Devin Smith, who's ranked 50 overall by the consensus board, and he's the 9th best receiver by a lot of people. The reason I have Devin Smith as my 4th receiver is because he is... I think that he's Deshaun Jackson, but with more intermediate capability. And I think that is super great. I think that's an immense amount of ability. I think that he is underrated for his intermediate route work because Ohio State didn't target him on intermediate routes. When you take a look at his intermediate route running, it's a lot better than what a lot of people think. And if you tell people who are somewhat familiar with Devin Smith, hey, I found a guy who's exactly like Devin Smith, but he's really good at running intermediate routes, they'd be like, oh, yeah, that dude's a first-round pick. Well, Devin Smith is the guy who is Devin Smith that runs really good intermediate routes. So I have him as my next guy. And then after that, I think there's a bit of a drop-off. For me, actually, and you can tell sort of what my bias is. My bias is for polish. For me, actually, the next person is Nelson Aguilar, who I think is Marquise Lee with hands, which is a very good receiver, right? And I think that you could give Nelson Aguilar a first-round grade and be somewhat comfortable. I probably would draft him at the top of the second, but that's sort of splitting hairs. And then after that, that's when I start getting into some of these other players. I think Jalen Strong is very good at the thing that he does. He's a one-dimensional receiver. It's a good dimension. But to me, he's a poor man's Mike Evans. And I think that you have to be really good at what you do to be Mike Evans and not do the other things. And I think Jalen Strong is not as good at Mike Evans, and you have to be really good at that thing. So that's why I have him rated a little bit lower. And then after that, it's sort of like a huge wash. These guys, I might actually rather have Chris Conley and Trey McBride later on than I would Rashad Perriman, Dorial Green-Beckham, etc. For Perriman specifically, I think that his hands issue is both overrated and underrated by a lot of people. I think that there are very serious concerns. And a lot of people are like, well, they're fixable. His catches look labored and stuff like that. But it is a good point to say, hey, his quarterback was terrible. Just awful. And his drop rate was much lower when Blake Bortles was his quarterback. Much, much lower. And those are two, I think, relevant areas of analysis. And I think when you have a guy as big as him that can run as fast as him, there's only so many players that can do something like that. But to me, I think you're basically getting I don't think he's as good a route runner as people are saying he is. I think maybe Philip Dorsett is maybe a little bit better at what you want Brashad Perriman to do than what Brashad Perriman is. And so I think that Perriman's a good receiver. I would rate him as a second-round guy. There's just so many people I take ahead of him that it's just not something I'd consider. And the hands issue is still concerning to me because, I mean, his drops were bad, his catches were bad. And I think that technique fixes happen in the NFL. I think they happen a little bit less often than people like to say. And I think that some of his problems are very difficult to correct.
Yeah, honestly, from top to bottom, I mean, we have a lot of similarities, and you touched on a lot of great points. Specifically, I mean, I'll just start at the top real quick. Won't waste a lot of time with the big three. It's the consensus big three, and I think Cooper, just one of the safest players in this draft. And when you can call a player at a skill position like that, one of the safest players, I think that speaks volumes to just how good this kid is. I mean, I think his floor is going to be a phenomenal number 2 receiver at the very least. You've flung out names like Reggie Wayne and Isaac Bruce. I mean, those are some big names and big shoes to fill. But I think Cooper, again, he's got speed. The one big, I mean, route running, the football instincts, right? The understanding of the football situation, every down, every play, where I need to be, what the defense is reading, what I'm gonna be able to do to help my quarterback out on this play. I think that's why it's just such a match made in heaven for Cooper to go to the Raiders, because I think he's just going to help out Derek Carr so much. And even though he's not flawless, I think he's not the greatest high pointer in the world. He's not going to be able to go get attack the ball at its highest point against some of these bigger, longer cornerbacks that he's going to face in the NFL. But besides that, he really from top to bottom does so many things well that I think it's a clear cut. Cooper is the number 1 receiver in this draft. But saying that, there's not a huge drop off between the next 2, right? It's kind of the big 3. I have Devontae Parker as well at number 2. I think that Parker really is going to be able to come into the league and be one of those mismatches right off the get-go. You look at last year, you saw Beckham Jr., you saw Mike Evans, you saw Kelvin Benjamin have a lot of success right away. I think it's Parker's ability to go up and get the ball at its highest point. His reach, his wingspan is just out of this world. And I know the numbers may say he's pretty much right there with everybody else, like a Kevin White, but when you watch him on tape, he gives the quarterback such a big catch radius that a lot of people worry about, what's his get-off like off the line of scrimmage? How well does he separate? I really don't worry about that as much as I do with Kevin White, because Parker just gives you such a big catch radius with where he catches the ball away from his body. He's such a tough guy to defend deep down the field and on intermediate routes, even on a quick slant, the way he can just reach out there and pluck that ball out of the air. I think he's going to come into the league and eventually turn into a true number 1 receiver, a guy that's going to give you a mismatch on the outside, basically on every down if you have a one-on-one opportunity. And then as you saw, if you ever see any of his highlights, he's a red zone nightmare as well. Just toss the ball up in a fade, and more times than not, he's going to come down with the ball. Kevin White, the only real thing I worry about Kevin White is just his ability to separate and really explode in and out of those cuts on those short to intermediate routes. Almost reminds me a little bit of Cordero Patterson, just the way I know this guy's a good athlete. I know he can do it, but why can't I see it on tape, him separating well enough to really really put himself in better positions, again, in those short to intermediate routes. And really, when the game of football is played, it's really 80-90% in those short to intermediate routes. You only get one deep ball thrown, maybe once every other drive, something like that. So you really got to be able to win and separate on those short to intermediate routes. Darrell Green Beckham has to be thrown in there somewhere. A lot of people have him at number 4, even though his upside may be better than all 3 of those guys. It's just the risk that you're getting with him. And then I'm with you as far as some of these smaller, quicker, shiftier guys are kind of the new craze now in the NFL. You look at a guy like Odell Beckham Jr., Sammy Watkins, Brandon Cooks, and I think what happened was you started to see a lot of the big boys, right? Julio Jones, A.J. Green, Calvin Johnson, and what teams started doing specifically, you look at Seattle, because that's the easy one to point to. Guys like Richard. Yeah, go get Richard Sherman, right? Go get me a long, lanky corner, and it works. I mean, it does work. And the thing is, though, the league is always evolving. Coaches are going to say, okay, well, how do we beat this guy now? He can't be invincible forever. They're really trying to find some smaller, shiftier, quicker receivers now that would seem like just a slot type of receiver, but they're putting him on the outside to really kind of mismatch and disengage some of these longer, lankier cornerbacks like a Richard Sherman. And you're starting to see a little bit of success, not a ton, but you're starting to see a little bit of these long, lanky guys be a little bit vulnerable against those smaller, quicker guys. And that's why I think guys like Nelson Aguilar, like you mentioned, Rashad Green from Florida State, Justin Hardy and Tyler Lockett, I'm infatuated with both of those guys, especially from where you can get them at. I think they're not just slot guys. I think they can be outside guys and turn into a legitimate number 2 receiver down the road. Tyler Lockett just destroyed the Senior Bowl when I was down there. He was basically uncoverable, whether it was short, intermediate, deep down the field, didn't matter. I love what that kid has to offer. And some rankings you look at, he's the 20th receiver on the board. So Justin Hardy, another guy, just love the way he runs routes. He attacks. He attacks the ball when it's in there. He drives back. He really he plays aggressive. He reminds me of just the style of play, almost like an Anquan Bolden. Devin Smith, I want to talk about him because you mentioned him. I think you might have him as your 5th receiver, if not 6th. And I'm with you. He's a guy who's a little one-dimensional, but that one dimension he's damn good at, and that is getting deep down the field. This guy was a 3-year starter on the track and field team at Ohio State. I think he won like the 100-meter state championship at Ohio State when he was in high school. I think he might have broke the record and still holds it to this day. He's a burner, and he reminds me a lot of Deshaun Jackson as well. While you maybe have him as a little bit more upside than Deshaun Jackson, I think he's a little bit miniature version of Deshaun Jackson. I don't think he quite.
I was being pretty aggressive by saying he's better than
yeah, you jumped the gun a little bit on that. I mean, why don't we just call him a Hall of Famer already? I think there's a lot of similarities, though, and right when I watched him, I, in fact, actually am working on another draft video breakdown of Prospect a Day, doing Devin Smith, should be done tomorrow, and although there's only about 4 games up on Draft Breakdown, it didn't take long to realize that, yes, this guy is somewhat one-dimensional. Sure, he kind of sets you up with a lot of, quick button hooks, a lot of short, intermediate, but it's that 1 or 2. The guy actually only averaged 2.2 catches a game, which you say, oh my God, that's god awful. But his average per catch
25 yards,
is 28.4 yards per catch. I mean, the guy averaged a touchdown every 4 catches. So he's a big play machine waiting to happen. Yes, is he a little one-dimensional? Sure. But the big thing is what I kind of stereotyped Devin Smith as right away was just a deep, almost like a Troy Williamson where, just go deep. But the thing is, his ball skills, he makes some acrobatic, unbelievable ball skills. When you look at it, I mean, you can see it in the defensive back's face and the body language. He just frustrates some of these guys because these guys think they're in the perfect position, and somehow this 6-foot even Devin Smith just finds a way to come down with the ball. It's very impressive. Again, I mean, he's kind of like my 5th, 6th receiver. They kind of mesh together there. But I really like his upside. I'm interested to see what team grabs him and how he ends up developing because, again, he's a home run waiting to happen. He's got to develop his route tree, though. He's got to develop into more than just a one-dimensional guy. Otherwise, he will end up being just a 3rd or 4th receiver on a team, which I don't want to see happen. Jalen Strong, I'm not as high on him as a lot of other people. Again, like you mentioned, a poor man's Mike Evans, a little too one-dimensional. And his one dimension, I'm just not as infatuated with as a Devin Smith who can hit the home run.
Good at that.
You got to be exactly. You got to be damn good at that. And then again, I think Nelson Aguilar is a guy you're starting to hear a lot of buzz about that could be not only a first-round pick, but I'm hearing top 20 buzz right now. What team is going to pick him there? I don't know, but you mentioned Marquise Lee better. I see a little bit of Randall Cobb with that burst that he has, and almost a guy that you might want to put in the backfield and motion back out into a couple routes, wheel routes, things like that. It's going to give you a nice chess piece in there. So it's a deep class of wide receivers. It just depends on what you need. What's interesting, though, as we sit here and kind of build up this class is that a lot of the guys that I mentioned that I really liked, Lockett, Justin Hardy, Philip Dorsett's a guy that I'm not quite as high on as a lot of people. But again, these smaller guys, they don't really fit the bill to what the Vikings need on their team right now. They need that Devontae Parker, that big go up and get it, the size mismatch to complement what they already have. When you look at the roster, Charles Johnson, Mike Wallace, Patterson, Jarius Wright, it's a good mix of guys, but they're similar qualities when you look at it. I think you look at it, you may have a lot of really good number 2 receivers. Who's the number 1 receiver? Who could progress into the number 1 receiver given the time and opportunity? And I'm just not sure any of them right now can you could say with confidence that they could be that guy. So even though on the depth chart right now, I don't see any room to invest a top 11 pick into a guy like Devontae Parker. I don't see the room right now, but when you look at Rick Spielman's MO, again, he's not just building for today and tomorrow. He's building 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, and Parker's going to give you that number 1 receiver. And again, it's all about progressing Teddy Bridgewater. This will give him a legitimate weapon 3 years, 5 years down the road consistently in those mismatches. Again, complement the other guys on the roster if they keep Mike Wallace for more than a year or two. Whatever Charles Johnson turns into, I think he's going to complement those guys a lot. So it's kind of devil's advocate. I don't see the room right now to invest an early round pick on a guy like Parker, but if you're looking more towards the future, it does make a lot of sense for both Bridgewater's progression and complementing the guys you currently have on the depth chart and roster, and kind of just that last missing piece to what Norv Turner needs to, again, stretch the field vertically. I mean, how long have we been saying, hey, AP, you suck 8-9 men in the box, but you'd never had that one guy that could consistently scare defenses when they're had that one-on-one, or at least make defenses pay down the field with that one-on-one mismatch. Parker is that guy. He will do that for you. So I like the class of receivers. The guys I like more than others, though, I just don't see a real fit for the Vikings in the middle of late rounds. So I think if you're going to pass on Parker, again, I don't think you need any of the guys that I mentioned, even though I love them. Tyler Lockett, Hardy, Philip Dorsett, Rashad Green from Florida State, Nelson Aguilar. I don't see the fit for us. You might as well at that point then, you might as well wait to the 4th, 5th round, similar to when they grabbed Greg Childs and Jarius Wright from Arkansas, and you might take some stabs on a Chris Conley from Georgia. You might take a stab on a Devin Funchess, who might be gone by then, but maybe a Vince Mail from Washington State, or a Desmond Lewis. Yeah, you bet. So I think it's kind of either go get a guy like Parker right off the bat. Otherwise, you might as well wait. And we're talking specifically for the Vikings plan. You might as well wait, I think, until maybe the 4th, 5th round for some of those, again, the guys that are going to complement what you have on the roster already. So that's kind of my take on the receivers. Brashad Perriman, too much hype for me. I get the size, I get the whole, basically, I mean, it always happens every year. There's one guy that just seems to get too much hype for my liking because he gets thrown up on NFL Network every other take. Mike Mayock likes him, so all of a sudden everybody loves him. He's got the size, speed, strength, numbers, 4.25, 40. Who's kidding who? I mean, he's enticing, but too unpolished for me. Seems to, I guess, just struggle to get consistent separation vertically. Too many drops on film. It's a bad habit that is almost just tries too hard sometimes. And like you mentioned, it lost Blake Bortles. A tough position to be in, inconsistencies at quarterback, but just lacks the polish to his game for me, that where he's being projected, there's other guys that I prefer over him to where he's being projected in the middle to late first round. So, I mean, when you think about it, a big receiver class last year, this is going to push that class to maybe not the same talent at the top, but overall depth. You're going to see a lot of receivers drafted. There could be, I think there's going to be at least 5, but there could be 6 or 7 receivers drafted. You talked about the big 3, Kevin White, Cooper Parker. DGB should be drafted. I have him pegged to usually those guys with the big upside but have some trouble off the field. They usually go the late teens, early 20s. You look at Randy Moss at 18, Percy Harvin at 21. That's usually where the risk-reward becomes worth it for a team, maybe like the Chiefs at 18, maybe like the Ravens at 20. I don't see them getting past the Ravens. So DGB, that's the 4th receiver. Everybody's telling me Perriman's going to go in the first round. I don't know where, but that's another one. Then again, I have Nelson Aguilar landing in the first round as well. So what is that? 4, 5, 6 receivers there. Maybe a Jalen Strong or somebody like that goes. That's 7. So I think you're going to see a lot of receivers go not only in the first round, but those top 40 picks as well.
Did you get all that, Josh? I hope you were taking notes.
Are we recording? We're not recording that? We got to do that all over? What the hell?
Yeah, do you remember what you said?
Not
Playoffs?
Practice. Who's talking about practice?
Practice?
Yeah.
So Tommy Gunn at Tommy the Gun 13 writes us, what is the over-under projection on the final number of draft picks the Vikings get this year? He has them at 10, just like last year.
I think the over-under's at 9.5.
Yeah. 9.5. Yeah, I like, I mean, the thing, right? I mean, he always wants 10, right? He always says he wants 10. My thing is, what do we got? 7 right now. You trade back, even say you trade back twice in the first round, which usually doesn't happen. Say he gains, 2 or 3 extra picks. The thing is, for me, he usually uses that ammo and trades back up and usually ends up, expunging some of those picks that he just garnished or just gained anyways in a trade. So 9.5, if that's the over, I'd probably take the under, believe it or not. Even though he always says he wants 10 picks, he seems to end up trading some of those away right after he gets them anyways. So I'm thinking, he'll probably end up with 7 or 8 picks somewhere in there.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Unless we end up with, a million 5th-round picks or something. I think it'll be hard for us to get to 10. So yeah, if the over-under is 9.5, I think I like the under as well.
And it even seems like
difficult to get both 10 picks and have 2 of them be first-round picks.
Right. Well, at a certain point too, I mean, it's tough to find roster spots for these guys, and I've seen Spielman in the past. Kind of once he gets to a certain point and he likes his draft the way it's kind of unfolded, he's willing to kind of exchange some of those for future picks next year, whether it's a 6th-round pick or a 5th-round pick, if he's pretty, I guess, satisfied with how the draft unfolded at that point, because we all know how the undrafted free agency process goes as well. You can always grab a guy or 2 there who might have a chance at, if not even making the 53, maybe making a practice squad at some point too. So I just don't. I mean, 9, even that's a lot. I know he says 10, but I think even 9 may be a lot.
Now, who are we to doubt Rick Spielman?
True.
Magic will happen, and suddenly we'll get a 4th-round pick out of nowhere.
Wait, I thought we were supposed to constantly doubt Rick Spielman, or at least the things he says.
Have you seen his guns? I'm not doubting shit.
I don't doubt his ability.
You can't doubt thunder and
just
lightning.
every word that comes out of his mouth.
I'm not calling him a liar, but
I'm just not calling him a truth teller.
I'm just saying that everything he says is a lie until proven otherwise.
All right. Do we have anything else on the mailbag?
One question from Steve Johnson at st_Vike. What is the most irrational thing that the majority of teams consistently do? I presume he means in the draft.
Man. Let their coaches draft? I don't know.
Yeah, I mentioned at the top just about how teams foolishly try to replace right away with their first-round pick, maybe a face of the franchise or a key or core piece to their team that maybe left free agency or they traded away. Similar, again, we mentioned the Randy Moss. Okay, go draft Troy Williamson right away. It's just unfair to do that. I think that's kind of a silly notion. I would almost do the opposite. I would try to go grab like 2 or 3 late round receivers in that situation and just hope one pans out and make sure you go nail your first round pick, maybe on the defensive side of the ball, because it's just not fair. Again, the fan base is just going to ask too much. The other big thing, though, somewhat irrational, I just think that teams always come out and they say, we're going to draft the best available guy. Well, to an extent, sure, but you're not going to go draft, say another running back when you already got Marshawn Lynch or whatever. I think that always comes to fruition and combines with their needs as well. You take your top 3 needs, maybe top 4 needs, and then you draft the best talent available or best player available. So I think that's a little skewed. I think that's a little irrational thing that some teams say they do, and in reality, I don't think they do that.
Yeah, I think for it's really difficult for me to answer this question. I'm sure I'll have like a better answer during the draft when a team does this, and I just have to sort of lose my mind over whatever they're doing. But I think teams are a little bit too optimistic about position changes. And I'm all about converting cornerbacks to safety. I think you can get some pretty good safeties by doing that. But I think for the most part, teams are a little bit too aggressive about it. I mean, you take a look at players like Adam Replogel, who is a phenomenal defensive tackle, being converted to guard. I think James Carpenter, same thing. You take a look at Ontario McCaleb, who's a running back that they converted to cornerback, I think, in Cleveland. Even some of these cornerback safety converts, Robert Blanton, that did end up working out, in my opinion. Even some of them don't really work out. And I think that the teams draft these athletes who you're asking to switch positions a little bit too readily. Players that played that position in college, it's a little bit different. I mean, when you take a look at Josh Shaw or Adrian Amos or even Byron Jones, they all played safety. Eric Rowe, they all played safety. So you're not really converting positions for them because they've showed safety instincts and have had safety technique coached into them. But for the most part, I mean, Anthony Barr worked out, but I mean, there's a lot of 3-4 outside linebackers that did not become 4-3 outside linebackers. So for every Von Miller, you have a Koa Macy, you have a Clint Sintum, you have a bunch of players who cannot make the conversion. And I think teams are a little bit too aggressive about it, which is not to say that they shouldn't do it. I just think they tend to overdraft some of these players pretty high. One player to maybe make a note of in this context, I think, is Nick Marshall.
You bet.
Who did play cornerback technically at Georgia for like a year and showed up as like a dime back in some situations. But I mean, he played quarterback at Auburn. And so, that's something to watch out for.
Tony Lippett from Michigan State. I know a receiver from big boy, 6'2", 192, Michigan State.
A lot of people are talking about him as a cornerback.
Yeah, they've flirted with him. Both those guys down to Senior Bowl. I mean, a lot of questions. A lot of coaches were asking them too, hey, would you be comfortable to switch? And I think, it's a tough spot to be in if you're a prospect that, isn't a guaranteed day one or even day two pick. Boils down to, well, at a certain point, do I just listen to what they want me to do and just be a yes man and just go try to do that, or do I have to step up and be able to say no with confidence that I'm going to be better in the long run at this position, and that's where I want to play? It's a tough spot to be in, I think.
Yeah, and no one got, I think, jerked around more about that than Joe Webb, who I think.
Oh yeah.
I think if he had been given, I think if we had defined a role for him and just stuck with that role, he'd be better off now than wherever he's with the Panthers, but I mean, like, he'd be a better quarterback if they just stuck him at quarterback, or he'd be a much better receiver if they only stuck him at receiver. That's part of it. You can jerk a player around, but also, I mean, Joe Webb, phenomenal athlete. Is he really ever going to be a receiver?
He was good in that playoff game for Ponder, right? Oh wait, all right.
Well, that'll be the end of you as a guest ever again.
Ooh.
Worth it.
Yeah, we don't talk about that.
Yeah, that's right up there with bringing up the fact that Donovan McNabb was a quarterback for 2 weeks.
That first drive.
All right, James, you're fired too.
He looked really good on that first drive. I thought we had it. I mean, he looked, and then we only got 3 points out of that drive, and then it just kind of went downhill from there.
Wait, so are we talking about?
Oh wait, we're done talking
Joe Webb,
about.
Donovan McNabb, Christian Ponder, or no? I'm just kidding.
Right.
So I think the funny thing about this question is that if you were to ask anybody in the league what is the most irrational thing that the majority of teams consistently do, they would all like to believe nothing. Like none
perfect.
of them. None of them want to believe that the majority of teams consistently do something irrational, even despite the pile of analytics, air quotes, about how bad coaches are at managing timeouts and fourth downs.
It's almost like this question almost reminds me of one of those pop-ups on like Huffington Post or on a website saying this one weird irrational thing is something that the majority of teams consistently do. This one weird trick.
This one weird trick.
GMs hate this one weird old tip. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think that that'll be a pretty good preview for everybody who's going to be watching the draft, which begins Thursday. It's first round.
Yep, Thursday at 7 Central, I think.
You got it. Yep.
Excellent. You will be able to catch all the details live on Vikings territory. Will you be doing the live bloggery, or will that be Adam?
I think Adam or Austin's doing the live blog at Vikings territory. I'm actually going to be. I don't think we even announced this at the Daily Norseman. I'm actually going to be doing draft coverage for the Daily Norseman at the draft, which I'm sure will be a pleasant surprise to people who just see an article pop up from me there. I haven't written there.
Like it'll be more unexpected than when Kyle occasionally posts an article.
Kyle writes?
That's what he says.
Kyle can read?
He wants a cut of that $10. I know that.
He can pry it out of my cold, dead fingers.
But why male models?
Truly good question. Luke, are you going to be doing anything special for draft day, or at least the first round at eDraft?
Yeah, well, I'll be at Winter Park. We weren't kidding about the carpooling. That's a real thing. That's going to happen. I'll probably have a GoPro hooked up somewhere so we can get all that on footage. Big gulps, huh? Well, see you later. Yeah, I'll be down at Winter Park. Not necessarily sure exactly my game plan as of yet, but probably to some degree be doing some live blogging. To be honest, man, I'll be putting in some work, but at some point it's just nice to kind of sit back and just enjoy the process, to be honest, because you work so hard and you put so much hours into it, and all of a sudden it's gone and it's over just like that. So it's fun to just sit back and enjoy the process to some degree, whether, whatever. Again, maybe some live blogging to some aspect, but we'll see how it all plays out. Kind of a little wild card right now, so we'll see how it all plays out. But nonetheless, it's going to be fun down at Winter Park. Arif's going to show me he's going to show me around and show me how to run things over at Winter Park, right?
Yeah, no, I'll tell you how everything works from where Spielman's war room is to sort of the secret cubbyhole you can hide in.
No,
only if you're a reef size.
That if you're a reef size, you can hide in. Yeah.
I'm gonna get there. It's gonna be like the Bean John Malkovich hole. I'm gonna be like, what the hell is this, dude? What the hell is this? What do you get internet? You get Wi-Fi in there, dude? How do you have Wi-Fi?
Arif actually just needs somebody to hold the extra Sharpies for when he's signing autographs for all the reporters.
The diehards.
I don't know what blogger has groupies besides Arif. It's great. No, and you know what? You make a really good point, Luke. You guys you bust your asses with all of this, mock drafting and preparation, and this is an opportunity for you guys to enjoy the show. And for everybody else who will be enjoying the show, yeah, just make sure you stay hooked in to VikingsTerritory.com, thedailynorseman.com, and eDraft.com, and for all your podcast needs, you can find this show at NorseCodePodcast.com or on The Daily Norseman. You can follow us on Facebook, Facebook.com/Daily Norseman, or on Twitter at NorseCodeDN. Our producer James is at Big Mono on Twitter. Our co-host and analyst and football talking head guy and secret hole knowledge haver, I guess, is Arif Hassan. You can find him at Arif Hassan NFL on Twitter.
Potential X-Men.
Cerebro doppelganger Arif Hassan. Luke, I had a sheet of paper here that had your Twitter handle on it, but then it got replaced by a picture of Dick Butt.
I'm not mad at you for that. I'm not mad at you for that. That's cool in my book. On Twitter at Luke_Spinman. Again, a lot of my work's out on eDraft.com. Make sure to check all the content that we're spitting out over there during draft weekend. And I've got some new videos for the draft profile video breakdown for the series A Prospect a Day. Still coming out. I got about 12, 15 good ones out there right now. Amari Cooper, Kevin White, Devontae Parker, Brandon Sheriff, Shaq Thompson, Eric Kendricks, Paul Dawson. There's a lot of them. I'm doing Devin Smith tomorrow. So I will probably continue to do those actually through the draft, just so people can kind of go find the guy that their team drafted in the first round and at least get a little look at some tape and a little bit of a breakdown as well. So check all that out. That's on eDraft.com. And again, the Twitter handle at Luke_Spinman. So I really appreciate you guys having me on. Had a lot of fun today. And again, just excited for this draft to really just kick off, man.
Hey, it's been a real pleasure having you on again, Luke. You are welcome anytime we need more of your extremely detailed draft knowledge. Thank you to everyone who listened as well. And that's going to do it for this week. Until you hear from us again, our formula is this. Everything I say is a lie. I am lying. We'll see you next week.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.